Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back into the studio. This is the final installment, probably, in a series that started a long time ago, back in early 2019. The world was a different place back then, and I was a little bit different, but here we are, early 2021, and it's time for Empyrean to make its final leg before exiting the studio to go to its new home. It's time for painting. If you want to learn more about how I sculpt, watch longer in-depth videos and get feedback on your own work from me, you can check out my Patreon page. There's a link in the description below the video. With the raw resin cast assembled and the seams repaired, it's time for painting. There are many ways you can go about doing this. You can use acrylic paint, you can use oil paint, you can use wax tinted with pigments, you can use one color, you can use many colors. There's a million ways to go about doing this essentially. Resin is nice because how you apply your finish is super flexible. I'm a little conservative perhaps in the way that I finish my resin castings, but I prefer to let the sculpture speak for itself and have a finish that allows that to happen. A finish that is not too distracting, in other words. Ultimately, for me at least, it's not about the finish at all, it's about what I made in clay and making sure that that still reads once it's all said and done. So with that goal in mind, I'll plan out the finishing process. I've done this type of finish before, so I know the way. I start out by spray painting the sculpture with an acrylic-based paint that has a bit of texture to it. There's a couple of reasons for this, and I'll get into those in 1 second. Make sure you wear a mask while spray painting, especially if you're not outside. Now, we have a big open studio that I work in with lots of air and lots of ventilation, and this paint is pretty friendly when it comes to smell. There's essentially no smell and the paint is acrylic, so it's not too bad for you. But it does leave a bit of paint dust in the air, so wearing a mask and goggles perhaps is probably recommended. I shake the can a lot before I start to paint, and I always spray a bit on an area which doesn't matter, like the base or something like that, before committing spray to the surface of the figure itself. And I constantly stay on the move and don't build up a lot of paint in one spot at a time. If you move around and only spray a thin layer on, you can keep the paint from becoming thick and covering a lot of your sculpted details and surface texture, which of course I would like to keep. I went through almost 2 cans and it took me about an hour to spray paint this piece. Granted, at least 30 minutes of that hour was spent waiting for the first paint layer to properly dry before applying the second one. You could of course hand paint it as well, but spray paint keeps the paint layer even and thin, and there's no brush marks. The reason I use textured paint with a matte finish is that I think it helps the next step bind to it a little bit better, and it also helps ensure that I don't get areas where the paint becomes glossy because it's applied too thickly. If I accidentally apply it too thick in one area, I can lightly dust over it once it dries to get some of that dry texture back. This keeps the entire surface of the sculpture even and leaves me with less struggles during the next step. Let's take a quick second to talk about how you can support the channel. Subscribing and liking the video is of great help, of course. If you would like to get something in return for your support, however, head over to my Patreon page. On Patreon, you can watch exclusive content like the Beginner's Guide to Figure Sculpture, which we just completed, and the Portrait series, which we just started, where I will show you everything you need to know about sculpting portraiture. You can also get personal feedback on your own work from me on anything you might need help with in your sculpting endeavors. So check it out, there's a link in the description below. After letting the spray paint thoroughly dry for a day or two, I arrive at the next step, and the next step is oil paint. As far as brands go, it doesn't really matter, but the colors do matter. I'm using a 50-50 mix of burnt umber and ivory black. I've experimented with this finish before, so I have an idea for what it will end up looking like. Now, I'm not very fancy when it comes to painting. I use a random brush I had laying around and some aluminum tray for cooking that I had to mix paint in. I looked around my studio for a palette knife to appear a little bit fancier than I am, but I couldn't find one, so I resorted to mixing paint with the back of my brush. Which works perfectly fine, of course. If the paint isn't mixed completely, it doesn't really matter either, because I'll end up with some natural variation in the surface, which I have no issue with. The idea for this paint job is to attempt to somewhat mimic the effect of a dark bronze finish. The technique I use is not very complex and something most people will be able to do. First, I paint on a layer of oil paint and then I rub it off with a rag that I made from an old t-shirt that I refused to wear because of its color. Lime green is not really me, if you know what I mean. The plan is to leave dark oil paint in the deeper areas of the casting in the recesses and rub off paint on the raised areas, leaving me with some natural contrast between the lows and the highs. As I'm not after a very strong contrast, I'm trying to actually rub off a very similar amount of oil paint everywhere. This will hopefully let the sculpted surface do most of the talking and not the paint job. But in some areas, the dark oil paint will be left behind completely. So getting the oil paint into all the nook and crannies is important, because if I don't do this, I'll end up with these small dots of lighter color from the acrylic spray paint, which will counteract the effect that I'm after and will probably look a little bit strange. The acrylic spray paint acts as a base coat, and depending on what color you choose, you'll get a different effect. If you use a very light beige color, then more of the brown in the oil paint mix will stand out and the contrast between light and dark will be much stronger. The darker the base layer, the less contrast there will be between the oil paint left in the recesses and the rubbed out raised areas. The more oil paint you rub off, the higher the contrast will be as well, and because I'm using oil paints, I can easily control the amount of paint left on the surface. Oil paint takes a while to dry, so if I feel like I've rubbed off too much, I simply go back and apply some more and rub it back down again a little bit. And I did this in several areas and even touched up a few areas the day after this was filmed. And you can do that with oil paint. Oil paint is much darker and much more glossy when it's fresh. As it dries out, it tends to become a little lighter and more matte. This is something that oil painters often attempt to fix by applying a layer of varnish to their finished paintings. And the varnish kind of rejuvenates the painting and makes it look like it did when they first painted it. A glossy surface tends to, in my opinion, to counteract my goal of showing the sculpted forms in all their mediocre glory. I've never been a huge fan of very glossy bronze patinas for this reason. Now on some pieces it works well, but I think when your work is primarily focused on internal information and the modeling of forms, a satin or matte finish complements that better. Perhaps this is my lack of experience when it comes to bronze, but I find it hard to make decisions about my clay sculpture based on the material it will eventually be cast in. Perhaps someone with more experience would be able to predict how the clay will look cast in bronze better than I can. But because of this, I tend to prefer to think the opposite way. How can I make the bronze, or resin in this case, look similar to my clay? Not in color or value, but in luster. In other words, how the surface reflects light. Some areas of thicker paint appear to be more glossy in this video, but as they dry out, they will fall more in line with the rest of the piece, become a little bit more matte again. The lightly textured spray paint surface also helps in giving the surface the sheen that I'm after, breaks up the light. A thicker and glossier paint would have contributed to a glossy finish. At the same time, I am, however, getting a subtle variety in the color of the finish, as I'm not able or attempting to rub off exactly an even amount of paint everywhere. This is very subtle, but you might be able to see that there is a slight variety in the surface that's not simply dependent on if it's a recess or not, but more dependent on a slight variety in how much paint was removed. The sculpted surface texture contributes to this variety a little bit as well, so it's more than one thing making this happen. Whatever it is though, I do like it, as it's an interesting feature that doesn't really distract from the sculpted piece itself, in my opinion at least. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, consider liking it and subscribing to the channel for more videos. I put out a new video every Thursday, so stay tuned for next week when the video will be about how I decide on where to separate my molds and how I go about doing so. If you want to support the channel, watch longer, more in-depth videos, or get feedback on your own work, visit the link to my Patreon page in the description below the video. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.